And with the traditional ringing of the bell, I open the meeting. We have an interesting meeting today. We're a bit low on numbers. I've had quite a lot of apologies. It appears that the sun is shining and people are managing to get out and about a bit more than they have been. But firstly, I'd like to welcome everyone and to welcome all our visitors. Clive, are there any visitors that are strangers to us that I could welcome particularly?
No, I'm pleased to say our speaker has joined us, and I'm pleased to see she's here. Are there any Rotarians who are joining us for the first time? Any visiting Rotarians? I'm talking about joining us for the first time. I can't see anybody on my first screen, and I can't see anybody waving at me on the second screen. So now it doesn't look like we've got any first-time visiting Rotarians today, President David.
Thank you. In that case, welcome everybody, and particularly those who are visiting us. I think I'd like to start the meeting by congratulating the candidates who were elected to council last Monday, and to commiserate a little with those that were not successful, but in the hope that they will apply in future, because we need the aspiration of a stronger and broader and younger council. So thank everybody who participated in the elections, which we'll be resolving into a council for next year in the next few days. I'd like to, I've had apologies, specific apologies from people you might expect to see, including Tom Swainland, Isabella Jones, and Nono Hardy, who have medical or other business commitments. Birthdays. I'm particularly pleased to see two of our birthday people on screen today. Firstly, I haven't seen Bob Blackwood. Is Bob around?
Bob Blackman. I haven't seen Bob.
Yes. Okay. Colin, congratulations on your birthday, and we wish you a very happy birthday of today. I've run out of my stock of digital. I've run out of my stock of digital pens, but I doubtless we'll be able to sort that once we're back at meeting at the Chesterfield. Also, I'd like to congratulate Mahmoud Ahmed on his birthday in a few days' time. Mahmoud, would you like to identify yourself on the screen so that we can all greet you and wish you a happy birthday?
Thank you very much for your greeting.
Happy birthday.
I'd almost forgotten it was my birthday until you reminded me, but it doesn't matter. Thank you.
That must mean that means you must be of a certain age, and not one that ends in a 0.
I think age is just you know, some sort of fiction that people make up. I try not to think about it too much. It serves me well.
I think that's true of many of us. Yeah. So anyway, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
I like now. Do we have visits to other clubs to report? That is, from those that are attending the meeting. I've heard of visits to clubs from people who are not attending the meeting. Are there any visits to clubs?
Redbridge Club, as usual.
Hello. Yes, Redbridge, yep.
Yeah, and in fact, you were there, President David, as well, for the Rotary in Britain and Ireland President Tom Griffin, our speaker, was last week.
I was.
Yes, and so was I.
Thank you, and Clive, thank you for joining. Can I do a quick plug for tomorrow's Together Talks? We've got the incoming Rotary International Director, Sheka Mehta, tomorrow, but I'll put something in the chat about it.
Put something into the chat. I know that I was looking to see if Brian Coleman was on screen, because he wanted to invite members of the club to hear a speaker, a journalist from the Metro, at his meeting this evening. I don't know whether he's not on the screen.
He's not here.
Okay.
He's not here.
Thanks. But if anybody wants to attend Brian Coleman's club this evening, I'm sure you'd be most welcome, but we'll have to find the links for you. Almoner, Harry, do you have anything to report this week?
Not with us, sir. Unusually.
Ah, okay. Yeah. Any announcements from council chairs? Sport, Brian.
Thank you, President. Just to confirm that all the invitations have gone out to our members to attend the district sports. We've had one reply with alacrity from immediate past President Tim and past President Louis in the golf doubles. But apart from that, I haven't had any other applications. I trust, President, that you will be entering the bowls, doubles and triples. I'm happy to join you. So we're looking for...
I'm happy to...
Go on.
I was going to say I am not a bowler, but I have a special position in that I own quite a number of bowls I've collected for other activities. So I can provide the bowls, but don't expect me to actually hit the jack too often.
Yeah, President. Then we also need people for clay pigeon shooting, and as it says, they'll give you instructions if you haven't done it before. And then we need people to apply for the tennis singles and doubles. So it's only 7 events in district. And I'm sure within our multifarious members of our club, we should be able to find at least 7 people to enter these sports. And I would urge all those listening or might not be listening to join in. Let me have their application forms. There's no charge to our members for the application. If on the event you have to pay for golf, that's down to you and your partner. But the actual application, which can be quite expensive in some things, the club will certainly meet the costs. And they've got to let me have the application forms. I'll post them on to the district chairman of sports.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman of the Sports Committee, Brian. Right, I think we can now move on to the main business of the day. Before we do so, I'd like us to do our traditional toast to the Queen, bearing in mind her particular circumstances of the moment, Her Majesty the Queen. So if you have your something with which to raise a glass, the toast is the Queen. I'd now like to introduce our speaker for the day, Fiona Czerniawska. Fiona is somebody whose name I have known for a very large number of years, but not someone that I know can claim to know personally. But her reputation goes before her. I've been involved in management consulting since the late 1970s. And it wasn't long before I was familiar with the Management Consultants Association, for which Fiona acted as a researcher. She has really got involved with research into management consulting. And as I said in my various bits of publicity, I don't think there's anyone in the world who knows more about the management consulting industry than Fiona. So without more ado, Fiona, could you just identify yourself on a screen? I can't see you on my screen because have you got to? Ah, I see you. Yeah, Fiona, if I could just say welcome to the Rotary Club of London. I know you have family members who are Rotarians and for whom this is a regular, or has been a regular experience. And we are so very pleased that you have made the time available from Source Global Research, which is a business you have put. You're the founder and deputy managing director of, and doubtless it takes an awful lot of time to organise and run. So we really do appreciate the time you are spending with us today. Fiona, can I pass over to you? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and I'm delighted to join you all. Yes, I'm the managing director of a research company based in the City of London, which looks at professional services, but particularly management consulting firms. And I'm sure those of you on the call are probably wondering why it's important to talk about management consultants. I hope during the course of my presentation to explain to you how big an industry this is, why you should want to know more about it, and also to answer some important questions about what consultants do. I think I'm not quite sure how long, David, you want me to speak for, but my plan is to speak for about 30 minutes, and then there'll be some time at the end of it if you have questions or things that you want to follow up on. I hope that's okay from all of your point of view. Excellent.
That's fine, thank you, Fiona. Yeah.
Great, well, let me share my screen. So I don't know if I've got any people on the call who have been management consultants or consultants of any form of business consultants. Medical consultants, I'm afraid, don't count here. But what I want to do is address probably the big question that comes to many people when you talk about consulting, which is, what role do they play in the economy? Are they parasites, as some people like to think? Are they people that go around and take money from clients and take their watch and tell them the time? Or are they people that create economic good for business? There are many, many jokes about consultants, and they're all uniformly thoroughly negative. One of my favorite ones was around somebody who's interviewed in a laboratory from a pharmaceutical company who is testing out their new drugs on not a group of rats, but a group of consultants. And he asked why he uses consultants in his laboratory experiments. He says, well, first of all, you can ask consultants to do anything. And secondly, there are more consultants than there are rats in the world. So consulting doesn't have the greatest reputation, but I want to suggest to you that perhaps some of that is due to lack of communication and lack of clarity about what's going on. And that's the part that needs fixing, not necessarily management consulting. I hope you can see my screen. I think I might need to do that to see it on presenter mode. Is that right?
That's fine. That's fine.
Perfect.
Yep.
Excellent. So now you can see it a little larger. So parasites or a force for economic good. The first question I get asked when presenting about management consultants is basically, what is management consulting? Everybody who's ever been a consultant probably has their own definition, but my definition is that it is the provision of advice and other support which is aimed at helping organizations improve their performance. Now, I think there are several components to that, some of which are well established, some of which are changing and will change again in the future. To me, the most fundamental one is about improving performance. Organizations that hire consultants want to do something better. And they hope that by bringing in outside expertise, objectivity, people who can see the wood for the trees, they actually get a result which will change their business. So clients are looking for improvement in performance. Helping organizations, consultants should never be, and consulting isn't, taking over what clients do for themselves. So there will always be clients and there will always be consulting firms. And depending on how you define it, they've always existed. You have people in organizations that get things done, and you have people that come in from the outside who help them do that. It shouldn't be the role of consulting to take over those businesses and do all the work for clients. Part of the role that consultants should play is helping organizations improve performance. The third thing to put here, which is something to mention here, which is something that has really changed a lot over the years, is about advice. Historically, consultants were advisors. The most famous book that somebody ever wrote about consulting was a man called David Maister, and he wrote something called The Trusted Advisor. And to him, and this book is, gosh, it must be about 30 years old, the essential role of a consultant is the helping part, it's the giving of advice. However, the first person to complain that consultants only give advice and don't give more substantial help was the chief executive of an American insurance company in 1983. So the consultants have a long history of being criticised for only offering advice, and they're often under pressure from the people they work with to do more than that, to help implement their recommendations, to get involved in clients' own businesses. And that's a long-standing challenge for the consulting industry, and it has some big implications for what clients ask firms to do and how well they're able to do it. So that's a starting point, definition of consulting. Let me give you some key statistics then about the consulting industry. I don't know if I did a straw poll here, how big you might have guessed the consulting industry is. Consulting is part of a much bigger global industry, which is about professional services. That includes tax companies, accounting firms, law firms, civil engineers, a wide range of people that offer professional advice. And that's worth about, globally, that market is worth about $1.2 trillion, or it was in 2020. The management consulting part of that is about 186 billion. So it's a very significant business right around the world. If we look at it just here in the UK, then it's worth about $15 billion a year. And what that tells you is that this is a market that's very skewed towards the US. So around 35% of all consulting is bought and carried out by US consultants. So anything that happens in the US colors what happens elsewhere in the world. And the US is often the kind of crucible of business ideas. So one of the reasons why consultants grew up in the US is to do with spreading innovation ideas to different companies. But that's not the only origin of consulting. Modern consulting as we know it really started in 1933 with the Glass-Steagall Act in the US, which changed the nature of banking and forced clients at that point who'd gone to their bankers to get advice to go to a different company. So you could no longer both be a banker and be somebody who provided advice. That created the consulting industry as we know it. McKinsey, one of the oldest and most established companies, existed before that, but it started growing significantly after it. It's not where consulting has stopped, but it tells you that a good part of consulting grew up because there was government regulation and organizations needed help implementing it. And of course, that regulation started in the US. So we've got two real drivers for the reason why we've ended up with a $186 billion industry, one of which is a thirst for innovation and about companies who needed to get good ideas from other companies, who needed smart people to help them think through their own good ideas. And secondly, we've got government intervention through the form of regulation and other types of work that organizations had to do and didn't necessarily choose to do. Before the pandemic, the global consulting industry grew typically at about 8% a year. Now that's much lower than it was growing in the 1990s. In the early 1990s, this was an industry that was growing by 15, 20, 30% a year. It was much smaller, so it's easier to grow when you're with big multiples when you're that small. But the other reason is that clients themselves have become better educated and more mature in the last 20 years. More mature in terms of buying outside help. So in 1990, when consulting was starting to grow at that huge rate, it was not uncommon for the leaders of businesses to have no tertiary education. And the average job tenure could be well into the kind of 25 years of working in one organization. So they needed consultants to bring new skills and also take ideas from one company to another. That's led to a huge amount of growth in the 1990s, but as clients themselves have become much more better educated, they travel the world, they work with many different companies. These senior people they still need consulting, and I'll explain why in a second. But it's likely that they're less likely to buy more of it very quickly. There are some exceptions to that. So if you looked around the world, the highest growth is in Asia. Particularly, it's in China. Now, I've quoted the post-crisis number there. And of course, China was ahead of the rest of the world in terms of both acquiring the virus, putting in restrictions, and then bringing their economies back into recovery. So perhaps it's not surprising that post-crisis, the Chinese economy and the Chinese consulting industry is growing more quickly than other consulting markets. But we're expecting the rest of the consulting industry this year to grow by 10%. So China is significantly ahead. And there are many reasons other than just the pandemic about that. Before the crisis, China was growing more quickly. It's partly that it's very keen on learning about innovation. It's very keen to expand overseas. It's investing in many different companies and in different countries. And therefore, they've been making a lot of use of Western thinking, and they're starting to build their own Chinese consulting companies. It's happening less where consultants are concerned, but if you look at the legal industry in China, it used to be that law graduates or graduates in international law went to work for international law firms who are based in Beijing or Shanghai or Hong Kong. Increasingly, though, they're now looking at international law firms run out of China. And it's quite likely that over the next decade, we'll see very sizable consulting firms that are Chinese in origin, as well as in terms of staff. What do consultants do all day? Well, it's a mixture of things. You can see on the right-hand side, about 35% of consulting work is actually around technology. So it's helping clients implement new technology systems. They've been in the forefront of helping them change during the crisis. But it's also about refreshing existing systems. Have they got the right kind of infrastructure? Are they secure? Have they got the cybersecurity protocols that they need to be in place? So that's 35%. So 1 in 3 of the consultants you might meet in the streets will actually be a technology consultant. There's still, though, a lot of operational work that consultants do, and that's just under a quarter of the market. What I mean by that is it's consultants who are going into organizations and looking at how they're run, the kinds of processes they have, how they get things delivered, how their factories are configured, what kind of machinery they use in their factories, how productive their people are. So that still accounts for a very significant part of consulting. And of course, it's one of the key areas that consultants have worked on over the last few decades. An area of more rapid growth recently has been in the risk space. Now, I've bracketed it here with regulation, but by risk, I mean it's helping clients manage risk. That can be governance, risk and compliance. It can be responding to government regulation. It might also be how the kind of protocols that they have for managing projects, third parties, their reputation. Risk is a phenomenally big business, and consultants have found a very good market for their services, helping clients manage risk. Strategy consulting is the part of consulting that most people think is consulting. It's done by people like McKinsey and Bain and BCG, and it's helping organizations work out where they want to go in the future, give them the data that they need to make those kinds of decisions, and to some extent helping shape the implementation of them. Strategy consulting isn't just done by those 3 firms. Strategy consulting is done by almost every management consulting firm these days. And actually, if you look at what McKinsey does, it does as much in terms of technology and operations as it does in strategy. So firms tend to offer a range of these services. There are 2 more smaller areas, but still very important. One is around financial management, which is about supporting the finance function, transforming it, looking at budgeting, planning, rolling out of finance. And the other one is about HR and change. That accounts for just 4% of the consulting industry, although ironically, if you speak to clients, they often say that 75% of what they buy is change management in the broadest sense. The extent to which they actually buy services that relate to people and policies and the HR function is in fact much smaller. So that's a profile of what the consulting industry looked like at the end of last year. So I said earlier that it's common when I'm talking about consulting to hear people say, well, consultants, surely they're a waste of money. They come in, they do all this stuff, and they're very expensive. And you only needed to be reading a certain kind of newspaper in the last few months to see just how important an issue that has become. So 3 different headlines from the Daily Mail going back to October last year. Consultants from KPMG trying to bring the test and trace program back on track. Just 5 days later, they're talking about average of £1,000 a day, and 3,000 have been hired to help with the taxpayer. By the 18th of January this year, they're talking about London firms paid up to £7,000 a day to run the test and trace part program. So it doesn't take much coverage like this for people to say consultants are massively overpaid and they're doing work that the government this is taxpayers' money that is being spent. I can see 1 or 2 of you on the call nodding vigorously at this point. So it's a very good question to ask. And I'm going to explain to you why you should carry on asking that question, but I'm also going to put the other side of things as well. But before I do that, I think you shouldn't just stop asking this question. There's actually a bigger question out there, which is what's happened more recently in the US. Now, it's one thing to be worried about when you pay your taxes that they're going to end up in the extremely beautifully silk-lined pockets of a McKinsey consultant. But it is another order of magnitude of worry to think that consultants might be so influential that they have an impact on people's lives. So for those of you who haven't followed this story, and I've got here the headline from the BBC and from the Financial Times, McKinsey did work with a variety of opioid manufacturers over the last few years. One of them is mentioned by the Financial Times is called Nevada. There's a much bigger range of firms that McKinsey worked with. All of that came to the culmination in the last few months, with McKinsey agreeing to pay almost $600 million in damages to the companies that they had advised. And that's an unprecedented amount of money for a consulting firm to pay to its clients. It's worth saying here that, as with all good legal agreements, McKinsey accepted no liability or responsibility for this, but they paid it as a settlement to stop the court case. So what were McKinsey doing? They were essentially doing strategy work for a variety of the opioid manufacturers, and they were helping those companies grow their business, and they were helping them grow their business by encouraging doctors and pharmacists to prescribe more opioid medicine, which was highly addictive. The result that many people became addicted to these, and indeed there have been many deaths as a resulting from that, where people overdosed. So this is about the worst thing that has ever happened in consulting, and it's extremely serious. And while we might worry about paying money to consultants on a daily basis, there are some very big questions about what consultants are accountable for and where they work with organizations. But I want to try and put this in context, because while the McKinsey behavior, I think, was completely unconscionable, and I would like to think that lots of people would lose their jobs in McKinsey as a result of this, and McKinsey clearly is going through a process of changing the way that it works, we need to put it in a broader context. Why, you might ask, if consultants are that expensive, if they commit these kinds of actions, do clients carry on spending 186 billion on consultants each year? So perhaps the question could be not, are consultants worth it, or are consultants accountable for their action, but why are clients so stupid? And the answer is they're not stupid, because while these things grab the headlines quite rightly, there is work done by consultants which clients clearly find helpful. So here is Accenture. Accenture is one of the biggest consulting firms on the planet. It employs about 500,000 people globally. It's not just a consulting firm, it's also a big technology firm. And in 2019, it was working with a few tens of thousands of people in the NHS to change the way the NHS communicated with itself. Obviously, the NHS is hugely complicated. It has multiple different systems, but actually it was very difficult for people to communicate via email. So all of those occasions when you've gone to a hospital and they've not got your details, when the notes get lost, where you find that people are still carrying paper notes around with themselves, then the NHS needs to change the way it communicated. They didn't have a single email system. So Accenture was working on a small scale program to integrate all of that with one email system, which meant that people could communicate better online. The article on the right-hand side, which comes from the NHS website, so not from a consulting firm, is around the extent that during the crisis, in the first 2 or 3 weeks of the crisis, it became obvious that the NHS was going to have to change the way it worked. And Accenture took this pilot project and in 14 days had moved 2.1 million people who either work for or interact with the NHS online to use Microsoft Teams, so their equivalent of Zoom, which also has with it an email account. That meant for the first time, all of those people could email each other quite comfortably. They could also have calls with each other to discuss patients, to pass on information. There is no doubt that without that technology, we as a country would be in a far worse position than we are today. So one consulting company working with people from the NHS managed to make a change that has been years in the thinking about, but took just 14 days to complete. It was an example of something that I think we saw during the crisis, which was organizations challenging themselves and the assumptions that they've made about what is possible. I was fascinated by an interview with somebody in the House of Lords who runs programs for getting homeless people off the street. And of course, in March, there were no homeless people on the street. They'd all been moved into hotels. And her view was, this is doable. It just requires somebody to say, it is unacceptable having people sleeping rough in a country as rich as ours. We will do something about it. What happened with the NHS is that the client, the chief executive of the NHS, the people that he works with said, we cannot carry on working like this. We need this system and we need it now. And we will do it irrespective of the complexity of what's out there, whether people are happy or not. We will just make this change happen. Because if we don't, we're not going to be able to get through the crisis. So these things tend not to make headlines in the Daily Mail. They're the good news stories. And there are many of those that sit behind the bad news stories. So taking my point about then, why do organizations use consultants? There are 4 reasons, and they remain as important today as they were 100 years ago. And they're very important reasons from a client point of view. The first is most organizations don't have enough people. They've been running, they're always trying to cut costs. They always try to keep things to a minimum. If something comes along, like a pandemic, they don't have enough staff. If the bank in 2008, faced with new regulation, didn't have the staff to implement that, they don't have enough people. They don't want to recruit enough people because if they did, they wouldn't be competitive. So organizations right around the world are chronically short of people. Consultants give them extra people. You can go to KPMG, you can go to Accenture, you can go to McKinsey and say, we can't manage this project. We need you to come in and do it for us because we just don't have the staff. Or maybe do that project over there because we want our staff to do this very important project over there. Consultants create organizational flexibility. It means that clients don't have to recruit people at short notice. It means they don't have to find skills that are highly scarce. They can go to a consulting firm to do it. If you're wondering if it's worth paying a consultant £1,000 a day or £7,000 a day, think how expensive, think what would happen the next time your boiler explodes. If your boiler breaks down, do you go off to train to become a plumber? It takes you time, it would cost you a lot of money. It's better to pay a few £100s to get the boiler repaired by somebody who knows what they're doing and can come in at short notice. So people don't have the capacity and they also don't have the expertise. That's the second important reason why people use consultants. Consultants have specialist knowledge. They spot where there are things happening, like particularly at the moment around new technology. They recruit people that know about that. They train them. They train their own staff so that when clients need help, they can go to a consulting firm and say, we need 5 people that have got these skills. During the pandemic, some of the big manufacturing and retail companies didn't have enough people to deal with the extra demand. So particularly there, you're thinking about people producing cleaning products, for example, huge amount of extra demand. I think that the market for cleaning products went up by 74% in March last year. They didn't have enough people, but they needed to get, so they brought consultants in to help them run part of their supply chain. And they brought in experts who'd run supply chains in other parts of the world who could hit the ground running. So there is a lot here about organizational flexibility. Consultants do come in from the outside. They are like your therapist. They're a person who sees in the things that you don't see for yourself. Every big organization has issues with what it's doing, and they get very tied up in their own politics. If you bring in a good consultant from the outside, then what they're bringing is objectivity and independence. Now, not all consulting matches up to this, but one of the most important reasons is that clients can turn to a consultant and say, we are weighing up this decision. We don't know whether to close our factory in Kuala Lumpur or our factory in Kenya. Which one should we do? Help us gather the data and give us your objective view about what our decision should be. Now, that doesn't always happen perfectly either. Organizations sometimes do that because they know what the answer is and they would rather not have to take it themselves. Sometimes they don't know where the data is and therefore they need help gathering it. But from a client point of view, it's a very important way of speeding up and improving their decision-making ability. Finally, if clients themselves are very busy and tied up and they don't always know what the right thing is to do, clients can turn to consultants to just get things done. The Olympics in 2012, that was hugely supported by consultants who did things like program management. So just making sure that the building of the new site, that the supplies to it were happening on time, that the right kinds of frameworks were in place, that the people supplying things weren't breaking rules. Execution is something that consultants do as well. So where does that leave us in terms of the recent stories? I'm putting both as kind of the story, if you like, behind the Daily Mail headlines. The first is that governments are like private sector organisations. They are chronically short-staffed. A very large proportion of people working in government are on short-term contracts, especially in this country. That notionally provides flexibility, but the reality is that they're constantly using external support. It's how they do things in this country. Sometimes they use consultants to kind of provide what we call staff augmentation, which is actually replacing civil servants. And that's been a government decision over the last 10 to 20 years to keep the numbers of permanent staff low and to use outside help. It's usually called contractors or interim managers, but essentially it's just consulting. Yes, in this country more than other countries, there's been a greater involvement of the private sector in the delivery of public services. So people like Capita and Serco. And Capita, of course, has been involved in the test and trace programme that the Daily Mail refers to. The decisions here have been a long time in the making. Again, the fact that the government turns to private suppliers is because it doesn't want to have too big and expensive an organisation in terms of the civil service. So consultants are providing organisational flexibility. They mean that during times when there is less work to do, the government is relatively cheap. During the pandemic, you've got to get people in there very quickly. The government can't recruit those people fast enough. It probably wouldn't get the right kind of skills. So turning to consultants to get something done quickly is important. The role of governments increased during a crisis, and it's particularly true during this crisis. And that means you've got a lot of people who are civil servants working in areas where they're not experts. And which would you rather do going into an operating theatre? Be operated on by a generic consultant, a generic medical consultant, or somebody who is, let's say, a specialist cardiologist? It makes sense to bring in outside help. However, the government has also, in recent years, had a track record of using consultants to do that, notionally that objective view. I'm sure it is objective, but it's a way of the government to avoid making some decisions. So the example there would be McKinsey and the NHS. The report that was produced and the changes produced from 2011 were largely written by McKinsey, and they've been gradually unpicked over the last few years. And the latest suggestions about reorganising the NHS will be the final nail in the coffin of those. So governments, and particularly the UK government, has certainly been guilty of outsourcing some of the thinking here. It's fine to outsource the doing to consultants. It's actually more efficient in the long term, and you get to better level of expertise. What governments and organisations should never do is outsource the thinking part of it. They do it because sometimes they want to distract people and they want a scapegoat. One of the major reasons I think you could argue that a firm like McKinsey is hired by an organisation like the UK government is it gets to blame McKinsey if something goes wrong, rather than blame the ministers who are supposed to take these decisions. At the heart of all of this is two problems, one of which is who is accountable for all of this? And secondly, how do you measure the impact of consulting by itself? And these two things are really muddled together. Clients bring consultants in. So if you look at the test, if you look at test and trace, you can argue that the consultants are being overpaid. It's really hard to see what they're producing. But you could also argue that the decisions to bring them in and how to use them were made by civil servants and government ministers. What tends to happen in a crisis in the private sector and the public sector is it's not clear who is in charge. So let's supposing for a second, and I don't know for certain, but let's supposing for a second that consultants have been hired to do a project, and then the government ministers step in and say, but that's not quite what we wanted, we have to do this. Consultants may be saying, well, that's not why you hired us, and it wouldn't be the best way of doing it, but the politics come into play. So there is an issue here about accountability, and there's an issue about the value that consultants add. So I can't solve or tell you much about government accountability. I'm not an expert on that, but I do know a fair amount about value and about value that consultants deliver. So a couple of charts here. The first one on the left-hand side shows you the results of tens of thousands of responses over the last 6 years, where we've surveyed senior users of consulting services right around the world, all in big organizations, all senior people buying a lot of consulting work. And they're talking there about the quality of work that's being delivered. So by the time we get to 2021, 72% of clients say that the work consultants do is either high quality or very high quality. So there is not an issue here about the quality of work that is being delivered. But if you ask these same people about have consultants added value, you get a much lower response. So in 2021, just 43% of organizations said that the value the consultants added was greater than the fees that they charged. And go back to what I said up front about what a consultant's there to do. They're to make organizations perform better. So you'd like to think that value here was about doing something better. So when you pay somebody for something, you get something that is better than you expect. But we need to look at those numbers more carefully, because actually what we find is that there are 43% who say that the value exceeded the fees charged. But that doesn't mean that 57% are saying that the value was less than the fees charged. In fact, about 44% of clients say the value was in line with the fees charged. They bought a service and they got a service, and they're fine with that. 1 in 10 clients, though, say the value was less than the fees charged. So there is a problem here about value, but it's not quite as big a problem as it looks at first sight. It's not quite as big a problem because actually clients, so 87% of people get what they asked for, and 43% of people get more than they expected, which I think feels like client satisfaction levels that many industries would be pleased to see. The bigger problem is that people don't know what the value looks like. They don't know what it is. They don't know why consultants are there. So we've done research over the years which looked at why clients hire consultants. What's the value that they are trying to get from them? Essentially, when we're thinking about the use of consultants, whether it's for test and trace, in government departments, in banks about regulation, in hospitals about technology, anywhere else, we should be asking one important question, which is what is it that consultants can do that clients, given enough time and money, what is it they can't do for themselves? In theory, the NHS could have put in that software by itself. If they'd recruited enough people, they'd taken enough time, they'd spent enough money on it, they could have done that too. But they almost certainly couldn't have put it in two weeks. It costs more per day to have people having consultants in there to do that, but it could have taken the NHS a decade to do that by itself. I use that deliberately because one of the chief executives of one of the hospital trusts said they've achieved more change in a few weeks than they had done over the previous decade. So the key question with consultants is not, are they worth it? It's not, are they adding value? Are they unscrupulous? It is understanding very precisely what they are there to do. And by that I mean, what is it that they are doing that clients cannot do for themselves? And they can really do 5 things. They can create a better solution. They can be innovative because they've worked with other companies and they've got different skill sets. So let's think of it in terms of the boiler breaking down. Your plumber coming in can simply just repair the boiler, and that's okay. Or maybe they repair a boiler in such a way that's going to last for another 5 years. They've put in something which is a better boiler solution. It might be that if you'd taken time to have all those evening classes and 2 years later, you can repair your own boiler, but the plumber can do it faster. Consultants can do things faster because they can do it. They have dedicated teams. They can come in. They're not distracted by business as usual. The plumber repairing your boiler can also make it safer. The repaired boiler is less likely to explode because they're trained and qualified. Consultants can play that role too. One of the big things that they've been doing in the last few months is working with organizations who moved all of their employees to using virtual working, but are now exposed to all kinds of cybersecurity risks. So they're trying to make things safer for clients. They can actually make it easier for clients to accept change. So your plumber coming in can just put your mind at rest. They can make you sit down with a nice cup of tea while they go and sort it out. And they can explain the new controls of that horrible new sophisticated thermostat without you having to read the manual. They can make your life easier. And when you add all of that up, the plumber that you hire, however expensive they are in the short term, is probably cheaper than you having a poorly performing boiler, a boiler that explodes again in a few weeks' time, a boiler that doesn't fit the kind of regulatory requirements, and one that you get very stressed about. It may seem counterintuitive, but over the lifetime of the thing that's there, consultants can be cheaper. But the important thing here is to have that conversation. So in summary, consultants do a good job. It may not always be apparent from reading the Daily Mail or the Financial Times, but most work is done well. Sometimes clients simply want them to come in and do something. Give us a new boiler, give us a new IT system. But where consulting should be focused is where they're adding value, which means doing things to help clients that they couldn't do for themselves. But more time needs to be spent by both consulting firms and the organizations they work with to decide what that is. I personally would like to see a smaller consulting industry, but one in which the level of value being added and recognized is far higher. Consultants should be made accountable for delivering that value, and about being clear about what their role is and the client's role. They also need to hold themselves ultimately to the idea of improvement and transparency, and they need to measure their impact. So in a nutshell, consulting is a force for good, but it's only a force for good if it's properly applied. If it's not properly applied, then you get things like the opioid crisis with McKinsey in the US. So it's about taking intelligent decisions when to use consultants. I guess the Greek philosophers would have said, everything is fine in moderation. Consulting is fine in moderation. So David, I'm happy to take a few questions. I'm sure you're all busy people, but if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Fiona, I'd be disappointed if we didn't have any questions to ask you, but I must admit, I started noting questions down as you started speaking, and you answered them as you continued to speak. So thank you very much, which for me was a very clear presentation. Before I ask for questions, I would just ask those on the screen to identify if they have ever describe themselves or are describing themselves as a consultant. If you could just wave a hand to answer that question. We have a few, Fiona, who have borne that tag, and I expect their questions might be slightly different. But over to Clive. Clive, would you lead the questions, please, for me?
Yes, thank you, President David. As usual, if you would like to ask a question, can you unmute yourself, because then that will bring you to the top of my list here, or raise your hand. So I'm going to start. I'm going to start with Eve and Robert. Eve, your question, please.
My question really, it is, I'm afraid, a bit critical. You talked about Capita being involved in track and trace, and frankly, track and trace has been disastrous. And what had to happen, you know, when we had the start of the pandemic in particular, was in areas up and down England and also elsewhere, of course, the local authorities actually moved in to do the track and trace and did a far better job. And as you know and have rightly pointed out, there's been a lot of concern about how this government has brought in these consultants and spent billions, which we as taxpayers are going to have to pay in the end, and they have been totally ineffective. So, you know, I really find it very concerning that people like Capita, who have no experience in track and trace, and other companies as well that were brought in with no experience in the health service, have been given these roles and have really made quite a mess of it, frankly. So my question is that, I mean, I don't think that's acceptable, actually.
But who is responsible for it? So of course it's both sides here who are to blame, but let's start with the fact that the government hired firms to come in, possibly without giving due scrutiny to those firms. I would say that it's not, and I think the firms are to blame in terms of they willingly took on contracts where they perhaps didn't have the expertise to do this. But I think that the issue here is not about consulting in general. It is about, and I think it will be unfair of those millions of people, and some of whom are on this call, who are good consultants, to believe that this is true of all consulting. To be fair to the government, it was an unprecedented crisis. They were trying to react. They were trying to do the right thing. But when you look at the money that's been spent, and of course, only part of that's gone to consultants, I trust there will be a massive public inquiry into this. I think there should be. And I think those decisions need to be understood and recognised, and the people who took them should be held accountable for them, unquestionably. But let's see that as being one project, one problem. And I don't think it's fair to say that and I'm sure you're not saying this, consulting as a whole has its reputation damaged by projects like this. But let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, because a lot of consultants do a good job, and a lot of clients set consultants up in a way that doesn't make it easy for them to do the job that they're trying to do, especially in politics. So I think clarity of who took what decisions would be a very good thing to uncover from the inquiry when we get to it.
Thank you. Who would like to ask the next question? If you'd like to unmute yourself, please, so you come in. Anthony Newton. Anthony, please.
Thank you very much, Fiona. I'm interested in one particular specialised aspect of consultancy, which is the security services in this country and many countries employing so-called consultants or contractors with all sorts of effects and consequences, most of which are to abrogate responsibility, legal responsibility on themselves. Any comments on that?
So was that a particular, you mean using consultants to avoid, a manager brings a consultant in so they can blame the consultant rather than take responsibility themselves?
Yes.
So I agree with you. I think that happens a lot. I think there are occasions when it's useful to have consultants as like the lightning rod for an organization that's very clear about a difficult decision. But I think that's, it takes us into very dangerous territory about what managers are responsible for. And as I said earlier, consultants are hugely helpful in getting things done, but they should never replace the decisions made by the leadership of an organization who is responsible for those decisions. And if they're bringing in consultants purely to use them as scapegoats, then they're not worth the salaries that they are being paid. I have to say that I think there's been a lot of negative publicity about some of the audit firms. And I think it's worth saying at this point that I have the same view about that, which is we can re-regulate the audit, we can create all kinds of new regulation about it. But at the end of the day, if you have a leadership team that wants to circumvent the financial audit because it's got results that it doesn't think would be acceptable to its stakeholders, then there isn't an awful lot your auditor can do about that. Right. So we shouldn't hold consultants always responsible for that. But clients, I think, are very guilty of trying to use consultants as scapegoats, and they should stop doing that. They should start doing what they ought to do, which is be leaders.
I was rather thinking of many governments' position of employing so-called contractors to do dirty things which the government can't be legally liable for or accountable for.
I know. So on the other hand, if you were the government, of course you'd do that. If I was the chief executive of Unilever and I got to make 25,000 people redundant, of course I'm going to bring in a consultant to do that. I mean, that's the world in which consultants operate. But they need to know that they're playing with fire.
Yes.
So, but I don't think it would ever stop an organization using consultants like that. I guess my main premise is it should be about transparency. We should know that this is what's going on. We should know how the government made its decisions about test and trace. The biggest problem in consulting is lack of transparency.
Absolutely.
And if we were clear, if we knew why people are there, what the kind of work that they're doing, how they're being paid, why test and trace couldn't do that by themselves, then we would all be far more, not only understanding, but far more able to make informed views about what's going on in consulting.
How can we get the sort of transparency we feel we as ordinary citizens obviously want and need?
Well, it's a challenge, isn't it? So regulation isn't going to help very much because look at the audit side of things, it just makes things more complicated. The thing that I think one has to hold them to is hold them to that standard. I think one of the interesting things at the moment is around sustainability. Consulting firms see sustainability as an opportunity to help clients become more sustainable. Sustainability isn't just about climate change, it's also about many other things, which includes trust and transparency. Now, how can a consulting firm work in that space if they are not also trustworthy and transparent? So my biggest hope here is that we are moving into a phase of business and society where transparency is valued and recognized more, and that consulting firms have to do that because they won't be able to recruit the right people, they won't be able to deal with the right clients. Pressure will mount in this area.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nick Bush, would you like to ask your question, please?
Hello, Fiona. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I wish I'd been able to give that to my family a few years ago when I was an active management consultant, and they always wondered what I did for a living. Well, my question is on when I've been into clients, one of the things I'm often asked to do is identify the next innovation that they should be thinking of. What would you say is the next innovation that consulting firms should be aware of?
So of course, if we knew all of that, then we would all be very wealthy indeed. So in the short term, I think the biggest innovation is going to be about speed and speed of change, because we do, amongst the research that we do, we ask clients, what do you think will be the biggest impact, permanent impact or permanent legacy of the pandemic. And they came down to 3 areas, one of which was they'll be thinking more about business risk, which you could understand. But the other 2 are very interesting because one of them is about more imaginative solutions and making change happen faster. I think the more imaginative thing is a quite high bar to jump, but I think the speed thing is something everybody will recognize. The fact that we watch every day organizations transform themselves in a way that we hadn't dreamt was possible is going to change this generation of senior leaders in terms of what they can do going forwards. I think it creates a huge challenge for consulting firms to keep pace with their own clients, but what they'll have to work on is speed of change.
So, thanks.
Thank you. And who would like to ask the next question, please? If you just unmute yourself or raise your hand, you will come to the top of the screen. I believe, David, you've had some questions, President David. There's an opportunity for you to ask if you would like to.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Fiona about her view of China, both as a consumer and a provider of consulting services. We have a lot of consultants, particularly those in the city, very keen to take money from China for providing advice on financial services in Shanghai or Nanjing or wherever it happens to be, providing all the skills that the city has to a potential or an eventual, not potential, an eventual competitor. Yeah. Now, when we have consulting firms based in China and they no longer are consuming all their own services and they want to sell to the West, do you think the West will be prepared to buy consulting services from China in the way that China is prepared to buy consulting services from the West?
So I first of all agree with you that I think Chinese companies and organizations have been very, very keen to learn from Westerners. And the Chinese consulting market is a bizarre combination of the very sophisticated with the very unsophisticated. So they make some choices that you would only see made by people who are very, very experienced buyers of consulting. And then the next day they make a choice that you think, why on earth would they use that firm? So they're learning very quickly and in some ways inconsistently. But they are definitely learning quickly. So would a Western company learn from a Chinese firm? Yes, indeed, they already are doing. If you look at Land Rover, if you look at the work where people have been bought by Chinese companies, Chinese know-how is being imported into those organizations. It's not called consulting, but it's definitely coming out. I also think that many Western organizations are now looking at China in terms of some of the innovative ways it's using technology. China was a great adapter of technology, or has been over the last 10 to 20 years, a very fast follower. But there's a lot of evidence that says that largely due to the amount of investment that's going into some types of technology, they will be quite a long way ahead of the West when it comes to innovating, not just technology itself, but business models and thinking differently. Does that come with worries about macroeconomic political instability and where kind of the handing over of data in one side or another? Yes, I think there will at the moment always be a shadow of that. But Western companies are very keen to work out what, if a Chinese consumer is interacting with their phone in a different way using augmented reality, then people in the West really want to understand that because it tells them about maybe how people will react in the future in London and in San Francisco. So yes, people like to know innovative things. I'm sure they'll be cautious in some respects, but I don't think that will stop them using Chinese firms.
Thank you.
Thank you. President David, can I now invite you to introduce the Rotarian who will propose the vote of thanks.
Indeed, Clive. Thank you very much indeed. And I call upon our Vice President, Ian Borkham, Fiona, to give you the vote of thanks on behalf of the club for an excellent presentation. Ian.
Mr. President, fellow Rotarians, thank you for asking me to give the vote of thanks. Can I apologise straight away that I haven't had time to get a consultant in to advise me on what I should say, but I hope I can rest on my experience. But Zoom is clearly getting much better because President David has already quoted some of the things I've written down on my paper here. The presentation was clear, was very clear and very concise. And above all, it was most interesting. And I was particularly interested, I mean, obviously we've heard about management consultants, but like perhaps other people don't know exactly what they do, and you really have brought that to the fore as to what they do, the history. I wasn't aware of the of how it all started in America, as it were, and how it's booming in China, as it were, at the moment. So that was all incredibly interesting. And you also showed the bad parts of the industry and the good parts, and where the industry not only has come from, but is going to. So all in all, I can see why President David said your reputation preceded you. You clearly are, you have proven that you are a leading light in the industry, and we've been very lucky and privileged to have you give your presentation to us today. And I'm sure that all the people on the call today will join in with me in thanking you very much indeed.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much. It's been great talking to you all, and thank you for the interesting questions as well.
Thank you very much, Ian. Rest with me now to present you with a digital, hopefully, if I'm a speaker certificate. These are normally hard copy produced and handed to you in person when you're speaking at the Chesterfield Hotel. But I'm afraid I have to move back to a digital media, Fiona, to actually provide you with this in some form of copy. Thank you so much again.
Well, that's very kind. And I think what we've all learned in the crisis is that digital is just as good as the physical sometimes. So thank you.
But sometimes not. If you just stay with us for a couple of minutes, I'll just close the meeting and thank you for that. The next week's speaker is Michael Kleissens of ITER, the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, talking about that and nuclear fusion. ITER is also used in the sense of the Latin meaning the way, because there is a view that this is the way forward. These are 35 countries collaborating to build the world's largest tokamak, a magnetic fusion device that's been designed to prove the feasibility of fusion as a large-scale and carbon-free source of energy, based on the same principle that powers our sun. China, EU, UK, India, Japan, Korea, Russia, and the United States are linked in that research, which is a 35-year collaboration project. So join us not next week, but on the 10th of May to hear that. Next week is a bank holiday and we're not meeting. Bearing in mind what the next speaker is going to be talking about on the 10th of May, will you all now join me in the final toast of our meeting, which is to Rotary and peace the world over, bearing in mind particularly peace. So if you join me, Rotary and peace the world over.
Rotary and peace the world over.
Thank you very much. And with the ringing of the bell, I will close the meeting and invite those that wish to stay for a few minutes to chat. And I don't know, we have got a couple of consultants on the call, Fiona, who might like to say hello to you. They're my guests, Nick Bush and Carol Szlezinski. So they might like to say hello to you, and I'd like to give them the opportunity to do so. Clive, if you'll hold us open for a few minutes,
I'll leave it open, David. Yes.
Thank you.
Fiona,
Carol, can we see you or not?
I was going to say, Kate, I was going to say, sorry, Fiona, I was going to say that I was aware of the opioid scandal, but wasn't aware of McKinsey's involvement in it, as it were. So I don't know if that's whether they managed to keep themselves out of the mainstream news or
they have a very effective PR.
Or just Daily Mail readers.
They have a very effective PR machine, I have to say, which is mostly designed to keep them out of the news. And I think one of the things that if you look at the previous crises, so if you go back to Enron and the death of Arthur Andersen, a lot hangs on being able to do that, to stop people joining up the dots and seeing a pattern. McKinsey is very, very good at stopping people see that pattern. It's back to the point that we discussed earlier about transparency. There's lots of things that are good about McKinsey, but the way it manages its interface with the world is perhaps not one of them.
It's very interesting, thank you.
Yeah. It's quite insular, isn't it, Fiona? McKinsey, they see themselves as a profession apart almost from the profession, as it were.
They do, but I think there will have to be some soul searching now, and they've clearly just been through a leadership election. There are clear attempts to go back to what they used to be. So there was a man called Marvin Bower who ran McKinsey from about 1940s to 1992, who was the Cardinal Richelieu, if you like, of consulting. But he had extraordinary high ethical standards about the behavior that he expected from consultants. And I think going back and revisiting some of those would be a good thing for any consulting firm to do, but perhaps particularly McKinsey at the moment.
I mean, moving into corporate finance was also a questionable act, I think, to be actually both sides of the equation.
Indeed, and it was, of course, and so you can track some of these problems back to the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed, I think, in 1993. So that created the problems that existed before the great crash, the Wall Street crash. I only have another minute, so I'm really delighted to meet those of you who are consultants. It's a great pleasure.
Nick, say hello.
Hello.
And Carol, say hello. Are you in Poland at the moment, Carol, or are you in London?
No, sadly not. Got locked down in the UK, but well, perhaps fortunately, because I might not have been able to listen to the talk, which I found absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much.
Hi, Fiona.
Hello.
My name is Deepri. Thank you very much for the talk. Very fascinating to hear all about the management consultants and what they get up to. Having done some management consultancy myself for a local borough, trying to help them with their slippage in terms of housing, and coming up with the same, more or less the same report, perhaps even a little bit more detailed than the management consultancy firm that was employed. So I think there's an awful lot of things that you've said there that could be taken on board.
And you're absolutely right. There's a role here for people in organisations to be consultants to their own organisations, to step away from them and stand back. And it's a very valuable thing to be able to do that. So I think internal consultants are undervalued in businesses.
Yeah, I wasn't actually internal. I was external. An awful lot of housing experience. So yeah. I think moving forward, I think the key thing is diversity here, because I think a lot of consultancy firms, the old boy network, are now out of touch, you see, with what's happening with the technology and the rest of it. So even though some of them are very, very much geared towards technology, it's more to do with innovation that we're lacking, to be honest, from my point of view.
Thank you. So your time is up, Fiona.
I'm afraid. I have to go and do another presentation, so I'm a little bit more have a harder time end this lot than I would normally do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
very much. Lovely to meet you. Have a great day.
I know. Hi, Hugh. Hi, David. Hi, Nick.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, everybody. I need to leave now, so have a fantastic day.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for joining us.
I was going to say that's Doug, not dog. Yeah.
I was going to say that.
I mean, just from my point of view, because it's what's on my application, I think, for Rotary, I was keen to have a speaker about consulting.
Yeah, definitely.
And so, that is the trade that I've supposedly been following. Unfortunately, you can knock about 10 noughts off the end of those numbers that you mentioned in terms of anything I was involved in.
Despite the fact you appear to be surrounded by old masters in your room, David.
Oh yeah,
for a past master of the.
I'm an old master myself, you see, Nick. So it's quite appropriate, isn't it? No, behind me is it's Paul Harris,
Can I throw in?
Colleen,
I'm really clear here. I do contract work. I don't call myself a consultant because that puts a hat on that people don't relate to. I'm an extra pair of hands who comes into a project for whatever time they want, and then they leave. Then I leave on to the next project. And there are times when I can't actually be considered for a role because I haven't worked at those top 4. The fact that I could do the job blindfolded, but because I haven't worked for, for example, KPMG or something like that. So it's the very much, you're completely wiped. So they are very closed shops. Can be very insular. People lack their confidence in their own business. Somebody mentioned this on the call before. The immediate reaction is people have to go outside and get a consultant firm to come in and do that, because they lack the confidence in their own skills and abilities to look at their own organization strategically and honestly. And part of the things I do as a contractor, because I won't use the word consultant, as a contractor or extra resource, is to draw that out from people. They already have the answers to a lot of the problems. They just don't have the confidence to present it back to the leadership. So I really want to call out Fiona's point that she made on that presentation, is that leadership have a lot of responsibility and questions to answer on their future behavior as to how the whole churn of information in an organization and into an organization happens going forward.